collected short stories of Louis L'Amour. Volume 1. Dutchman's Flat. The dust of Dutchman's Flat had settled in a gray film upon their faces, and Neil could see the streaks made by the sweat on their cheeks and brows, and knew his own must be the same. No man of them was smiling, and they rode with their rifles in their hands, 6 grim and purposeful men upon the trail of a single rider. They were men shaped and tempered to the harsh ways of a harsh land, strong in their sense of justice, ruthless in their demand for punishment, relentless in pursuit. From the desert they had carved their homes, and from the desert they drew their courage and their code. And the desert knows no mercy. Where's he heading, you reckon? Home, most likely. He'll need grub and a rifle. He's been living on old Sorson's place, Kimmel spat. He's welcome to it. That place starved out 4 men I know of. He stared at the hoof tracks ahead. He's got a good horse. Big buckskin, reckon we'll catch him. Pardon? Sure, not this side of his place, though. There ain't no shortcuts we can take to heat him off. And he's pointing for home, straight as a horse can travel. He ain't trying to cover his trail none. No use trying. Harding squinted his eyes against the glare of the sun. He knows we figure he'll head for his ranch. He's no tenderfoot, Kinsey expressed. The thought that had been drawing upon them all in the last 2 hours. He knows how to save a horse, and he knows the trail. They rode on in near silence. Harding scratched his unshaven jaw. The dust lifted from the hooves of the horses as they weaved their way through the cat-claw mesquite. It was a parched and sun-baked land with only dancing heat waves and the blue distance of the mountains to draw them on. The trail they followed led straight as a man could ride across the country. Only at draws or nests of rocks did it swerve, where they noticed the rider always gave his horse the best of it. No rider of the desert must see a man to know him, for it is enough to follow his trail, and these things are the ways of a man made plain, his kindness or cruelty, his ignorance or cunning, his strength and his weakness. There are indications that cannot escape a man who has followed trails, and in the 2 hours since they had ridden out of freedom, the 6 had already learned much of the man they had followed, and they would learn more. What started it? The words sounded empty and alone in the vast stillness of the basin. Harding turned his head slightly so the words could drift back. It was the manner of a man who rides much in the wind of rain. He shifted the rifle to his left hand and wiped his sweaty right palm on his coarse pants leg. Some loose talk. He was in the Bonton buying grub and such. Johnny said something at which he took offense, and they had some words. Johnny was wearing a gun, but this Locke wasn't, so he gets him a gun and goes over to the Longhorn. He pushes open the door and shoots Johnny twice to the body in the back. Harding spat. He fired a 3rd shot, but that missed Johnny and busted a bottle of whiskey. There was a moment's silence while they digested this, and then Neil looked up. We lynching him for killing or busting the whiskey? It was a good question, but drew no reply. The dignity of the 5 other riders was not to be touched by humor. They were riders on a mission. His eyes dripped over the dusty copper of the desert. He had no liking for the idea of lynching any man, and he did not know the squatter from Source and Plate. Living there should be punishment enough for any man. Besides, who saw the shooting, he asked. Nobody seen it, actually. Only he never gave Johnny a fair shake. Sam was behind the bar, but he was down to the other end, and it happened too fast. What's his name? Somebody call him Locke? Neil asked. There was something incongruous in lynching a man whose name he did not know. He shifted in the saddle, squinting his eyes toward the distant lake, dancing in the mirage of heat waves. What's it matter? Locke, his name, Chatlock. Funny name. The comet drew no response. The dust was thicker now, and Neil pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth. His eyes were drawn back to the distant blue of the lakes. They were enticingly cool and beautiful lying across the way ahead and in the basin off to the right. This was the mirage that lured many a man from his trail to pursue the always retreating shoreline of the lake. It looked like water. It really did. Maybe there was water in the heat waves. Maybe if a man knew how, he could extract it and drink. The thought drew his hand to his canteen, but he took it away without drinking. The slosh water in the canteen was no longer enticing, for it was warm, brackish, and unsatisfying. You know him, Kimmel? Kinsey asked. He was a wiry little man, hard as a whipstock, with bits of sharp steel for eyes and brown muscles, corded hands. I wouldn't know him if I saw him. Sure I know him. Big feller, strong made, rusty like hair, and maybe 40-year-old. Looks plumb salty, too. And from what I hear, he's no friendly sort of man. Squaw at that Sorensen place looks plumb suspicious, for no man can make a living on that dry-as-bone place, no fit place for man nor beast. Everybody figures no honest man would squat on such a place. It seemed a strange thing to be searching out a man whom none of them really knew. Of course, they all had known Johnny Webb. He was a handsome, popular young man, a daredevil and a hellion, but a very attractive one, and a top hand to boot. They had all known him, and he had all liked him. Then one of the things that made them so sure that this had been a wrong killing, even aside from the shots in the back, was the fact that Johnny Webb had been the fastest man in the Spring Valley country. Fast and a dead shot. Johnny had worked with all these men, and they were good men. Hard men, but good. Kimmel, Hardin, and Kinsey had all made something of their ranches, as had the others, only somewhat less so. They had come west when the going was rough, fought Indians and rustlers, and then battled drought and dust and hot, hard winds. It took a strong man to survive in this country, and they had survived. He, Neil, was the youngest of them all, and the newest in the country. He was still looked upon with some reserve. He had been here for only 5 years. Neil could see the tracks of the buckskin, and it gave him a strange feeling to realize that the man who rode that horse would soon be dead. Hanging from a noose in one of those ropes attached to a saddle worn of Hardin or Kimmel. Neil had never killed a man or seen one killed by another man, and the thought made him uncomfortable. Yet Johnny was gone, and his laughter and his jokes were a thing of past. They had brightened more than one roundup, more than one bitter day of heartbreaking labor on the range. Not that he had been an angel. He had been a proper hand with a gun and could throw one. And in his time, he had his troubles. He's walking his horse, Kinsey said, leading him. He's a heavy man, Hardin agreed, and he figures to give us a long chase. Gone lame on him, maybe, Kimmel suggested. No, that horse isn't limping. This lock is a smart one. They had walked out of the ankle-deep dust now, and were crossing a parched, dry plain of crusted earth. Hardin reined in suddenly and pointed. Look there! He indicated a couple of flecks on the face of the earth crust, where something had spilled. Water splashed. Careless, Neil said. He'll need that water. No, Kinsey said. He was pouring water in a cloth to wipe out his horse's nostrils. Bet you $1. Sure, Hardin agreed. That's it. Horse breathes a lot better. A man running could kill a good horse on this flat. He knows that. They rode on, and for almost a half hour no one spoke. Neil frowned at the sun. It had been on his left a few minutes ago, and now they rode straight into it. What's he doing? Kinsey said, wonderingly. This ain't the way to his place. The trail had turned again, and now the sun was on their right. Then it turned again and was on their backs. Hardin was in the lead, and he drew up and swore wickedly. They ranged alongside him and stared down into a draw that cracked the face of the desert. Alongside the trail they had followed, below them was a place where a horse had stood, and across the bank something white fluttered from the parched clump of greasewood. Kinsey slid from the saddle and crossed the wash. A slip of white. He stared at it, and then they heard him swear. He walked back and handed it to Hardin. They crowded near. Neil took the slip from Hardin's fingers after he had read it. It was torn from some sort of book, and the words were plain enough scrawled with a flat rock for a rest. That was a fair shootin'. Anyways, 6 ain't nowhere's enough. Go fetch more men. Man in the gray better tighten his girth, or he'll have him a sore-backed hoss. Why that? Short swore softly. He was lying within 50 yards of us when we come by. Had him a rifle too. I seen it in a saddle scabbard on that buckskin in town. He could have got one of us anyway. 2 or 3 most likely, Kimmel commented. The men stared at the paper and then looked back into the wash. The sand showed a trail, but cattle had walked there too. It would make the going a little slower. Neil, his face flushed and his ears red, was tightening his saddle girth. Others avoided his eyes. The insult to him, even if the advice was good, was an insult to them all. Their jaws tightened. The squatter was playing Indian with them, and none of them liked it. Fair shooting, yeah, Sutter exploded. Right in the back. The trail led down the wash now, and it was slower going. The occasional puffs of wind they had left on the desert above were gone, and the heat in the bottom of the wash was oven-like. They rode into almost, seeming to push their way through flames that seared. Sweat dripped into their eyes until they smarted and trickled in to tiny rivulets through their dust-caked beards, making their faces itch maddeningly. The wash spilled out into a wide, flat bed of sand left by the rains of bygone years, and the tracks were plainer now. Neil tightened his bandana and rode on, sodden with heat and weariness. The trail seemed deliberately to lead them into the worst regions, for now he was riding straight toward an alkali lake that loomed ahead. At the edge of the water, the trail vanished. Locke had ridden right into the lake. They drew up and stared at it unbelievingly. "He can't cross," Hardin stated flatly. "That's deep out to the middle. Darn treacherous, too. A horse could get bogged down mighty easy." They skirted the lake, taking it carefully, 3 going one way and 3 the other. Finally glancing back, Neil caught sight of Kenzie's uplifted arm. "They found it," he said. "Let's go back." Yet as he rode, he was thinking what they all knew. This was a delay, for Locke knew they would have to scout the shores both ways to find his trail, and there would be a delay while the last 3 rejoined the first. A small thing, but in such a chase it was important. "Why not ride on to the ranch?" Short suggested. "We might," Hardin speculated. "On the other hand, he might fool us and never go nigh it. Then we could lose him." The trail became easier for now. Locke was heading straight into the mountains. "Where's he going?" Kenzie demanded irritably. "This don't make sense nohow." There was no reply. The horsemen stretching out in the single file, riding up the draw into the mountains. Suddenly Kimmel, who was now in the lead, drew up. Before him a thread of water trickled from the rock and spilled into a basin of stones. "Huh?" Hardin stared. "I never knowed about this spring before." "Might as well have a drink." He swung down. They all got down, and Neil rolled a smoke. "Somebody sure fixed her up nice," he said. "That wall of stone making, that basin, ain't so old." "No, it ain't." Short watched them drink and grinned. "He's a fox, right enough. He's an old Ladino, this one. A regular mossy horn. It don't take no time for one man to drink and one hoss. But here we got 6 men and 6 horses to drink, and we lose more time. You really think he planned it that way?" Neil was skeptical. Hardin looked around at him. "Sure, this Locke knows his way around." When they were riding on, Neil thought about that. Locke was shrewd. He was desert-wise, and he was leading them to chase. If not, even Hardin knew of this spring, and he had been 20 years in the Spring Valley country. Then Locke must know a good deal about the country. Of course, this range of mountains was singularly desolate, and there was nothing in them to draw man. So they knew this about their quarry. He was a wise man in the ways of desert and trail, and one who knew the country. Also, Neil reflected, it was probable he had built that basin himself. Nobody lived over this way but Locke, for now it was not far to the sourcing place. Now they climbed a single horse trail across the starkly eroded foothills sprinkled with clumps of Joshua and Spanish bayonet. It was a weird and broken land where long fingers of black lava stretched down the hills and out into the desert as though clawing towards the alkali lake they had left behind. The trail mounted steadily, and a little breeze touched their cheeks. Neil lifted his hand and wiped the dust from his brow, and it came away in flakes, plastered by sweat. The trail doubled and changed, now across the rock face of the burnt red sandstone, then into the lava itself, skirting hills where the exposed ledges mounted in layers like a vast cake of many colors. Then the way dipped down, and they wound among huge boulders smooth as so many water-worn pebbles. Neil sagged in the saddle, for the hours were growing long, and the trail showed no sign of ending. "Lucky he ain't waiting to shoot," Kimmel commented, voicing the first remark in over an hour. "He could pick us off like flies." As if in reply to his comment, there was an angry whine above them, and then the crack of a rifle. As one man, they scattered for shelter, whipping rifles from their scabbards, for all but 2 had replaced them when they reached the lake. Hardin swore, and Kimmel wormed his way to a better view of the country ahead. Shore had left the saddle in his scramble for shelter, and his horse stood in the open, the canteen making a large lump behind the saddle. Suddenly the horse leaped to the solid thud of a striking bullet, and then followed the crack of the rifle echoing over the mountainside. Short swore viciously. If he killed that horse... But the horse, while shifting nervously, seemed uninjured. "Hey!" Kesney yelled. "He shot your canteen." It was true enough. Water was pouring onto the ground and swearing. Short started to get up. Sutter grabbed his arm. "Hold it. If you get the canteen, he could get you." They waited, and the trickle of water slowed, then faded to a drip. All of them stared angrily at the unrewarding rocks ahead of them. 1 canteen the less. Still, they had all filled up at the spring and should have enough. Uncomfortably, however. They realized that the object of their chase, the man called Chatlock, knew where he was taking them, and he had not emptied that canteen by chance. Now they understood the nature of the man they followed. He did nothing without object. Lying on the sand or rocks, they waited, peering ahead. "He's probably riding off now," Sutter barked. Nobody showed any disposition to move. The idea appealed to none of them, for the shot into the canteen showed plainly enough the man they followed was no child with a rifle. Kimmel finally put his hat on a rifle muzzle and lifted it. There was no response. Then he tried sticking it around a corner. Nothing happened, and he withdrew it. Almost at once, a shot hit the trail not far from where the hat had been. The indication was plain. Locke was warning them not only that he was still there, but that he was not to be fooled by so obvious a trick. They waited, and Hardin suddenly slid over a rock and began a flanking movement. He crawled, and they waited, watching his progress. The cover he had was good, and he could crawl almost to where the hidden marksman must be. Finally he disappeared from their sight, and they waited. Neil tasted the water in his canteen and dozed. At last they had heard a long yell, and looking up, they saw Hardin standing on a rock far up the trail, waving them on. Mounting, they led Hardin's horse and rode up on the trail. He met them at the trailside, and his eyes were angry. "Gone," he said, thrusting out a hard palm. In it lay 3 brass cartridge shells. Found them standing up in a line on a rock. "And look here," he pointed, and they stared down at the trail where he indicated. A neat arrow made of stones pointed down the trail ahead of them, and scratched on the face of the sandstone above were the words, "Follow the signs." Kisney jerked his hat from his head and hurled it to the ground. "Why, that dirty—" He stopped beside himself with anger. The contempt of the man they pursued was obvious. He was making fools of them, deliberately, teasing them, indicating his trail as to a child or a tenderfoot. "That ratty back-shooting killer," Short said. "I'll take pleasure in using a rope on him. Thinks he's smart." They started on, and the horse ahead of them left a plain trail, but a quarter of a mile farther down along 3 dried pieces of mesquite had been laid in the trail to form another arrow. Neil stared at it. This was becoming a personal matter now. He was deliberately playing with them, and he must know that would set with men such as Kimmel and Hardin. It was a deliberate challenge. More, it was a sign of the utmost contempt. The vast emptiness of the basin they skirted now was becoming lost in the misty purple light of late afternoon. On the right, the wall of the mountain grew steeper and turned a deeper red. The burnt red of the earlier hours was now a bright rust red, and here and there along fingers of quartz shot their white arrows down into the face of the cliff. They all saw the next message, but all read and averted their eyes. It was written on a blank face of the cliff. First there was an arrow pointing ahead, and then the words, "Shade, so you don't get sunstruck." They rode on, and for several miles, as the shadows drew down, they followed the markers their quarry left at intervals along the trail. All 6 of the men were tied and beaten. Their horses moved slowly, and the desert air was growing chill. It had been a long chase. Suddenly Kimmel and Kesney, who rode side by side, reined in. A small wall of rock was across the trail, and an arrow pointed downward into a deep cleft. "What do you think, Hardin? He could pick us off man by man." Hardin studied the situation with misgivings and hesitated, lighting a smoke. "He ain't done it yet." Neil's remark fell into the still air like a rock into a calm pool of water, as the rings of ripples spread water into the thoughts of the others 5. He waited. Locke could have killed 1 or 2 of them, perhaps all of them by now. Why had he not? Was he waiting for darkness and an easy getaway, or was he leading them into a trap? "The devil with it!" Hardin exclaimed impatiently. He wheeled his horse and pistol in hand, started down into the narrow rift in the dark. One by one they followed. The darkness closed around them, and the air was damp and chill. They rode on, and then the trail mounted steeply toward a grayness ahead of them, and they came out in a small basin. Ahead of them they heard a trickle of running water and saw the darkness of trees. Cautiously they approached. Suddenly they saw the light of a fire. Hardin drew up sharply and slid from his horse. The others followed. In a widening circle they crept toward the fire. Kesney was the first to reach it, and the sound of his swearing rent the stillness and shattered it like thin glass. They swarmed in around him. The fire was built close beside a small running stream, and nearby was a neat pile of dry sticks. On a paper laid out carefully on a rock was a small mound of coffee and another of sugar. Nobody said anything for a minute, staring at the fire and the coffee. The taunt was obvious, and they were bitter men. It was bad enough to have a stranger make such fools of them on a trail. To treat them like tenderfeet, but to prepare a camp for them? I'll be cussed if I will, Short said violently. I'll go sleep on the desert first. Well, Hardin was philosophical. Might as well make the most of it. We can't trail him at night no way. Kimmel had dug a coffee pot out of his pack and was getting water from the stream, which flowed from a basin just above their camp. Several others began to dig out grub, and Kesney sat down glumly, staring into the fire. He started to pick a stick off the pile left for them, and then jerked his hand as though he had seen a snake. Getting up, he stalked back into the trees, and after a minute he returned. Sutter was looking around as suddenly he spoke. Boys, I know this place. Well, I never knew about that crack in the wall. This here's the Mormon well. Hardin sat up and looked around. Derned if it ain't, he said. I ain't been here for 6 or 7 years. Sutter squatted on his haunches. Look, he was excited and eager, sketching with a stick in the sand. Here's the Mormon well where we are. Right over here to the northwest, there's an old sawmill and a tank just above it. I'll bet a side of beef that darn killers hold up for the night in that sawmill. Kesney, who had taken most to the heart that the taunting of the man they pursued, was on his knees, staring at the diagram drawn in the damp sand. He was nodding thoughtfully. He's right. He sure is. I remember that old mill. I holed up there one time in a bad storm, spent 2 days in it. If that sidewinder stays there tonight, we can get him. As they ate, they talked over their plan. Traveling over the rugged mountains ahead of them was almost impossible in the darkness. And besides, even if Locke could go the night without stopping, his horse could not. The buckskin must have a rest. Moreover, with all the time Locke had been losing along the trail, he could not be far ahead. It stood to reason that he must have planned just this, for them to stop here, and to hole up in the sawmill himself. We better surprise him, Hardin suggested. That sawmill is heavy timber, and a man in there with a rifle and plenty of ammunition could stand us off for a week. Has he got plenty? Sure he has, Neil told him. I was in the Bonton when he bought his stuff. He's got grub and he's got plenty of 44s. They do for either his Colt or his Winchester. Unspoken as yet, but present in the mind of each man, was a growing respect for the quarry. A respect and an element of doubt. Would such a man as this shoot another in the back? The evidence against him was plain enough, or seemed plain enough. Yet beyond respect, there was something else, for it was no longer simply a matter of justice to be done, but a personal thing. Each of them felt in some measure that his reputation was at stake. It had not been enough for Locke to leave an obvious trail, but he must leave markers, the sort to be used for any tenderfoot. There were men in this group who could trail a wood tick through a pine forest. Well, Kimmel said reluctantly and somewhat grimly, he left us good coffee anyway. They tried the coffee and agreed. Few things in this world are so comforting and so warming to the heart as hot coffee on a chilly night over a campfire when the day has been long and weary. They drank and they relaxed, and as they relaxed, the seeds of doubt began to sprout and put forth branches of speculation. He could have got more than one of us today, Sutter hazarded. This one is brushwise. I'll pull that rope on him, Short stated positively. No man makes a fool out of me, but in his voice there was something lacking. You know, Kesney suggested, if he knows these hills like he seems to, and if he really wanted to lose us, we'd have to burn the stump and sift the ashes before we found him. There was no reply. Hardin drew back, and they eased the leg of his pants away from the skin, for the cloth had grown too hot for comfort. Short tossed a stick from the meat pile into the fire. That mill ain't so far away, he suggested. Shall we give her a try? Later, Hardin leaned back against a log and yawned. She's been a hard day. Both them bullets go in Johnny's back? The question moved among them like a ghost. Short stirred uneasily, and Kesney looked up and glared around. Sure they did. Didn't they, Hardin? Sure. He paused thoughtfully. Well, no, one of them was under his left arm, right between the ribs. Looked like a heart shot to me. The other one went through near his spine. The heck with it, Kesney declared. No slick rustling squatter can come into this country and shoot one of our boys. He was shot in the back, and I seen both holes. Johnny got that one nigh the spine, and he must have turned and tried to draw, then got that bullet through the heart. Nobody had seen it. Nell remembered that, and that thought rankled. Were they doing an injustice? He felt like a traitor at the thought, but secretly he had acquired a strong tinge of respect for the man they followed. The fire flickered and the shadows danced a slow, rhythmic quadrille against the dark background of trees. He peeled bark from the log beside him and fed it into the fire. It caught, sparked brightly, and popped once or twice. Hardin leaned over and pushed the coffee pot near the coals. Kesney checked the loads in his Winchester. How far to that sawmill, Hardin? About 6 miles the way we go. Let's get started. Short got to his feet and brushed off the sand. I want to get home. Got my boys building a fence. Either keep a close watch or they are off gal hooting over the hills. They tightened their saddle girths, doused the fire, and mounted up. With Hardin in the lead once more, they moved off into the darkness. Neil brought up the rear. It was damp and chill among the cliffs and felt like the inside of a cavern. Overhead the stars were very bright. Mary was going to be worried, for he was never late, nor did he like leaving her alone. He wanted to be home, eating a warm supper and going to bed in the old four-poster with a patchwork quilt Mary's grandmother made, pulled over him. What enthusiasm he had for the chase was gone. The warm fire, the coffee, his own weariness, and the growing respect for Locke had changed him. Now they all knew he was not the manner of man they had supposed. Justice can be a harsh taskmaster, but Western men know their kind, and the lines were strongly drawn. When you have slept beside a man on the trail, worked with him and with others like him, you come to know your kind. In the trail of the man, Chat Locke, each rider of the posse was seen the sort of man he knew, the sort he could respect. The thought was nagging and unsubstantial, but each of them felt a growing doubt, even Short and Kesney, who were most obdurate and resentful. They knew how a backshooter lived and worked. He had his brand on everything he did. The mark of this man was the mark of a man who did things, who stood upon his own 2 feet, and who, if he died, died facing his enemy. To the unknowing, such conclusions might seem doubtful, but the man of the desert knew their kind. The mill was dark and silent, a great looming bulk beside the stream, and the still pool of the mill pond. They dismounted and eased close. Then, according to a prearranged plan, they scattered and surrounded it. From behind a lodgepole pine, Hardin called out, "We're coming in, Locke. We want you." The challenge was harsh and ringing. Now that the moment had come, something of the old suspense returned. They listened to the water, babbling as it trickled over the old dam, and then they moved. At their first step, they heard Locke's voice. "Don't you come in here, boys. I don't want to kill none of you. But you come in, and I will. That was a fair shooting. You got no call to come after me." Hardin hesitated, chewing his mustache. "You shot him in the back," he yelled. "No such thing. He was a-facing the bar when I come in. He seen I was heeled, and he drawed. As he turned, I beat him to it. My first shot took him in the side, and he was knocked back against the bar. My second hit him in the back, and the third missed, and he was a-fallen. You hombres didn't see that, right?" The sound of his voice trailed off, and the water chuckled over the stones, and then sighed to a murmur among the trees. The logic of Locke's statement struck them all. It could have been that way. The long moment passed, and then Hardin spoke up again. "You come in, and we'll give you a trial. Fair and square." "How?" Locke's voice was a challenge. "You ain't got no witness. Neither have I. Ain't nobody to say what happened there but me, as Johnny ain't alive." "Johnny was a mighty good man, and he was our friend," Short shouted. "No murderin' squatter's going to move into the country and start shooting folks up." There was no reply to that, and they waited, hesitating a little. Neil leaned disconsolately against the tree where he stood. After all, Locke might be telling the truth. How did they know? There was no use hanging a man unless you were sure. "Gab!" Short's comment was explosive. "Let's move in, Hardin. Let's get him. He's lying. Nobody could beat Johnny. He knows that." Webb was a good man in his own country, Locke shouted in reply. The momentary silence that followed held them, and then almost as a man they began moving in. Neil did not know exactly when or why he started. Inside he felt sick and empty. He was fed up on the whole business, and every instinct told him this man was no backshooter. Carefully they moved, for they knew this man was handy with a gun. Suddenly Hardin's voice rang out. "Hold it, men! Stay where you are until daybreak. Keep your eyes open and your ears. If he gets out of here, he'll be lucky, and in the daylight we can get him. Or fire the mill." Neil sank to a sitting position behind a log. Relief was a great warmth that swept over him. There wouldn't be any killing tonight. Not tonight, at least. Yet, as the hours passed, his ears grew more and more attuned to the darkness. A rabbit's rustled, a pine cone dropped from a tree, the wind stirred high in the pine tops, and a few stars winked through, lonesomely peering down upon the silent men. With daylight they moved in, and they went through the doors and up to the windows of the old mill, and it was empty and still. They stared at each other, and Short swore viciously, the sound booming in the echoing empty room. "Let's go down to the Sorson's place," Kimmel said. "He'll be there." And somehow they were all very sure he would be. They knew he would be because they knew him, for their kind of man. He would retreat no farther than his own ranch, his own hearth. There, if they were to have him and hang him, they would have to burn him out, and men would die in the process. Yet with these men there was no fear. They felt the drive of duty, the need for maintaining some law in this lonely desert and mountain land. There was only doubt, which had grown until each man was shaken with it. Even Short, whom the markers by the trail had angered, and Kesney, who was the best tracker among them, even better than Hardin, had been irritated by it, too. The sun was up and warming them when they rode over the brow of the hill and looked down into the parched basin where the Sorensen place lay. But it was no parched basin. Hardin drew up so suddenly, his stouter horse almost reared. It was no longer the Sorsen place. The house had been patched and rebuilt. The roof had spots of new lumber upon it, and the old pole barn had been made watertight and strong. A new corral had been built, and to the right of the house was a fenced-up garden of vegetables, green and pretty after the desert of the day before. Thoughtfully and in tight cavalcade they rode down the hill. The stock they saw was fat and healthy, and the corral was filled with horses. "Been a lot of work done here," Kimmel said, and he knew how much work it took to make such a place attractive. "Don't look like no killer's place," Neil burst out. Then he flushed and drew back, embarrassed by his statement. He was the youngest of these men and the newest in the country. No response was forthcoming. He had but stated what they all believed. There was something stable and lasting and something real and genuine in this place. "I've been waiting for you." The remark from behind them stiffened every spine. Chatlock was there, behind them, and he could have a gun on them, but if one of them moved, he could die. "My wife's down there fixing breakfast. I told her I would have some friends coming in, a posse hunting a killer. I've told her nothing about this trouble. You ride down there now, you keep your guns, you eat your breakfast, and then if you feel bound and determined to get somebody for a fair shooting, I'll come out with any one of you or all of you, but I ain't going to hang. I ain't naming no one, because I don't want to force no fight on anybody. You ride down there now." They rode, and in the dooryard they dismounted. Neil turned then, and for the first time he saw Chatlock. He was a big man, compact and strong. His rusty brown hair topped a brown sun-hardened face, but with the warmth in his eyes it was a friendly sort of face. Not at all what he expected. Hardin looked at him. "You made some changes here." "I reckon." Locke gestured toward the well. "Dug by hand. My wife worked the windlass." He looked around at them, taking them in with one sweep of his eye. "I've got the grandest woman in the world." Neil felt hot tears in his eyes suddenly, and busied himself loosening his saddle girth to keep the others from seeing. That was the way he felt about Mary. The door opened suddenly, and they turned. The sight of a woman in this desert country was enough to make any man turn. What they saw was not what they expected. She was young, perhaps in her middle 20s, and she was pretty, with brown wavy hair and gray eyes and a few freckles on her nose. "Won't you come in?" "Chat told me he had some friends come in for breakfast, and it isn't often we have anybody in." Heavy-footed and shamefaced, they walked up on the porch. Kesney saw the care and neatness with which the hard-hewn planks had been fitted. Here, too, was the same evidence of lasting, of permanence, of strength. This was the sort of man a country needed. He thought the thought before he fixed his attention on it, and then he flushed. Inside the room was as neat as the girl herself. How did she get the floor so clean? Before he thought he phrased the question, she smiled. Oh, that was Chat's idea. He made a frame and fastened a piece of pumice stone to a stick. It cuts into all the cracks and keeps them very clean. The food smelled good, and when Hardin looked at his hand, Chat motioned to the door. There's water and towels if you want to wash up. Neil rolled up his sleeves and dipped his hands in the basin. The water was soft, and that was rare in this country, and the soap felt good on his hand. When he had dried his hands, he walked in, and Hardin and Kesney had already seated themselves, and Locke's wife was pouring coffee. Men, Locke said, this is Mary. You'll have to tell her your names. I reckon I missed them. Mary? Neil looked up. She was Mary, too? He looked down at his plate again and ate a few bites. When he looked up, she was smiling at him. My wife's name is Mary, he said. She's a fine girl. She would be, but why don't you bring her over? I haven't talked with a woman in so long, I wouldn't know how it seemed. Chat, why haven't you invited them over? Chat mumbled something, and Neil stared at his coffee. The men ate in uncomfortable silence. Hardin's eyes kept shifting around the room. That pumice stone, he'd have to fix up a deal like that for Jane. She was always fussing about the work of keeping a board floor clean. That washstand inside, too, with the pipes made of hollow logs to carry the water out so she wouldn't have to be running back and forth, that was an idea, too. They finished their meal reluctantly. One by one, they trooped outside, avoiding each other's eyes. Chat Locke did not keep them waiting. He walked down among them. If there's to be a shooting, he said quietly, let's get away from the house. Hardin looked up. Locke, was that right what you said in the mill? Was it a fair shooting? Locke nodded. It was. Johnny Webb prodded me. I didn't want trouble, nor did I want to hide behind the fact I wasn't packing an iron. I walked over to the saloon, not aiming for trouble. I aimed to give him a chance if he wanted it. He drawed, and I beat him. It was a fair shooting. All right, Hardin nodded. That's good. Now for me. I reckon you're a different sort of man than any of us figured. Let's mount up, Short said. I got a fence to build. Chat Locke put his hand on Hardin's saddle. You folks, come over sometime. She gets right lonesome. I don't mind it so much, but you know how women folk are. Sure, Hardin said. Sure thing. And you bring your Mary over, he told Neil. Neil nodded, his throat full. As they mounted the hill, he glanced back. Mary Locke was standing in the doorway, waving to them, and the sunlight was very bright in the clean, swept dooryard.